Hello and good evening, everybody. It is me, Julian, and today I would like to attempt a philosophical analysis of a movie that I just watched that I thought was supremely interesting, namely the latest film by director Sean Baker titled Anora. And it's a wonderful film about a young woman who essentially works as a sex worker who is hired by the son of a Russian billionaire. And it's sort of an inversion, if you will, of the pretty woman narrative structure. And what I'd like to do in this video is use this film to talk about some philosophical categories and concepts, namely the part of no part from Jacques Rancière, as well as Zizek's theory of violence. In fact, this is a film that, even though it is a satirical film, it's a comedy throughout most of its runtime, is nevertheless a deeply critical film. I think you could argue that it is a form of leftist filmmaking, or perhaps, to put it differently, that it practices a critique of ideology. Jacques Rancière once wrote that cinema is perhaps the ultimate art form for the critique of ideology. After all, it panders in the dissemination of fantasies, which therefore makes it ideally suited to the undermining of said fantasies. Now, the central theme of this film, like for many of Sean Baker's films, including The Florida Project, the central theme of this film is work, and the invisible, silent work that goes into sustaining the fantasy life of the rich and famous, the rich and affluent. But it's about much more than that, so that's what I'd like to discuss in this coming video. But first of all, hello to everybody joining me live. It's so nice to see you here. This is a weekly live stream dedicated to making philosophy and theory more accessible. And if you'd like to support my work, please do consider becoming a patron. On Patreon, you can find the complete Intro to Zizek ebook series, as well as the ongoing ebook subscription, the latest edition of which is titled The Fundamental Fantasy and is a short introduction to Lacanian psychoanalysis. Okay, so let's begin. One of the central aspects of the critique of ideology is that it essentially makes the invisible visible, which is to say, it's not about unearthing some mystery or conspiracy that is being kept out of reach, but instead it's about pointing out that which is invisible in plain sight. This means that the critique of ideology almost always revolves around what you might call systemic forms of oppression or violence. In the film Anora, we see this because the central gambit of this film is that what appears to be a fairy tale romance about a woman being invited into the life of an extremely rich young man is in fact a social satire about the myriad levels of invisible labor that go into sustaining this man's life. And as their relationship begins to disintegrate and all of these layers of employees have their livelihoods tied up in this unraveling, it becomes an increasingly critical farce. What I'd like to do here is I'd like to talk about the difference between subjective and objective violence. But it's a film about violence, essentially. It's a film about the violence that essentially is required for everything to keep going on as it is. And here it might be instructive to talk about Zizek's differentiation between what he calls subjective and objective violence. Subjective violence is violence that is committed directly, like in a fight between two people or between two nations. And yet objective violence is the seemingly hidden, invisible, systemic violence of everyday life that we take for granted as it facilitates the status quo. In fact, if you look around you and you think about all of the countless hours people have to spend doing what feels like meaningless work in order to facilitate the lifestyle of others, you realize that this hidden and systemic violence is the day-to-day oppression of many people. And one of the things that cinema does so well is that cinema sells us a fantasy. It's essentially a dream that we can step into or perhaps better yet, we don't have to step into it, we can enjoy it from a distance. For example, Pretty Woman is a wish fulfillment narrative. The ideology of Pretty Women is that it allows the relatively impoverished character into the life of the rich and famous, and she becomes essentially initiated into their ways, which is to say, Pretty Woman is a fantasy of being released from the day-to-day grinds, the systemic violence of day-to-day, if you will, exploitation. Hence, it's a pseudo-emancipation. It's a fantasy of being able to escape one's social situation and being rescued, of course, rescued by the very person one is exploited by. Whereas what Anora does so well is that Anora essentially shows the limits of this fantasy, the process by which this fantasy is itself always fraught with numerous layers of ideological manipulation. But perhaps I'm being a little bit too obtuse here. So let's look at another Žižekian concept. Žižek says that the primary or the exemplary form of contemporary objective violence is that which assists in the creation of what he calls frictionless capitalism. And frictionless capitalism is the fantasy or the idea of a frictionless world, a world of glitz and glamour, comfort and leisure. And yet this world of frictionless capitalism has to be continuously facilitated by an entire army of unseen individuals who essentially make it happen. These can be cleaners or drivers. They can be the people who sweep the streets, etc. We're constantly surrounded by an army of underpaid staff that are facilitating both the basic functioning of everyday life, which was shown beautifully in the recent film Perfect Days, which depicted the life of a toilet cleaner, but also the life of the rich and famous, who essentially rely upon not just visible service staff, but also an array of further tiers of people who facilitate their lives. Žižek says that, therefore, the idea of frictionless capitalism becomes a kind of transcendental goal or pursuit. We all pursue the ultimate dream of a life that is without friction, that is without problem. And you can see this on many different layers. For example, a dating app that promises you that it will find you the perfect match promises you a frictionless version of love. You don't have the messy problems of falling in love with somebody and realizing only too late that they're actually not right for you. The app promises to take this away. Hence, the app sells you the idea of frictionless love. You could see this, for example, with technocratic, centrist liberal politics that say we want frictionless democracy in which we outsource our problems to consulting agencies like McKinsey, etc. This post-political turn, by which I mean the idea of a politics that is frictionless, was one of the key markers of 1990s and early 2000s capitalist, centrist, liberal ideology. But you could even go as far as citing a recent interview with Elon Musk, in which he said that when he took over the platform formerly known as Twitter, now X, his goal was to try to reduce what he called the wasted minutes. In other words, trying to create a more frictionless version of participating on X. Now, whether or not this is a goal he accomplished can be argued, but it goes back to the central ideological motif of frictionless capitalism. After all, the ultimate dream of frictionless integration into the digital ecosystem is, of course, Elon Musk's idea of a chip which is embedded directly into your head. This idea of frictionless integration, therefore, is one of the ideological motifs of late-stage capitalism that, in so doing, also mirrors the very systemic objective violence of those people who are hidden within plain sight so as to allow for the continued functioning of capitalist participation. And this fantasy of a frictionless existence was also articulated by Orson Welles, who once dreamed out loud of a machine that would allow him to bypass the screen and allow him to directly manipulate the emotions of his viewers. Once again, you can see here how if an art form, or cinema, surpasses the screen, in other words, if an art form were to be directly plugged in to the brain and emotional receptors of its audience, thereby triggering and inducing emotions in them without friction, we would have essentially a totalitarian vision of complete hegemony, of complete submission to the overarching ideological system. To go back to Rancière's idea that cinema is perhaps the perfect art form for the critique of ideology, we can see here how cinema itself, by means of its editing, by means of its contradictory tones and moods, allows essentially for an undermining of the very frictionless participation as an audience member in the viewing of cinema as such. Which is a lengthy way of saying that when you watch a movie, if you're simply chasing experience, if you're simply chasing wanting to be in the movie, what you're chasing is once again a frictionless experience. Whereas strictly speaking, a film, and I think this is what distinguishes cinema from a mere blockbuster, is that film practices what Bertolt Brecht would have called a Verfremdungseffekt. This is essentially an effect of alienation. There are moments in which the film appears to undermine itself, so that the audience can become cognizant of the thematic themes rather than merely being immersed in the film as such. In fact, one of the things that Anora does really well in the film is that there are sequences in which we are fully immersed in watching voyeuristically the sex worker at work. We see lengthy lap dance sequences. In fact, one of the key sequences is when she's giving an erotic dance to the young billionaire's prodigy, and it culminates in a seeming transcendental moment in which, as she rubs her body against his, the sun hits the light, the sunlight hits the windows so perfectly that it creates lens flares on the camera, and the entire scene is washed out in life. And yet this is undermined by a hard cut to a panned out shot of Anora, the sex worker, as she is zipping herself up after having performed the act. And here we have this undermining of the frictionless experience of watching the film as such, which is how the film undermines the very ideology or fantasy it appears to be selling in the first place. Hence, the first 20 minutes or so of this film give you the fantasy in its most straightforward form. The young woman who is released from her existence, who essentially finds a way out, who wins the lottery, as it were, by being asked by this billionaire's son to be his wife. And yet, then we see in succession stages how this fantasy disintegrates and crumbles. And one of the funniest things about this movie, and indeed it is a very, very funny movie, it's essentially a satire, a comedy, is that as this escalates, more and more people who work for the billionaire essentially become involved in this struggle. And none of them want to be part of this. Their general attitude is always, I'm just trying to get through a day's work. In fact, even the people they encounter in their quest to essentially salvage this marriage or to annul it, which essentially, I won't spoil it, but this is their goal, leads them into conflict with other people who are simply trying to get through a day's work. One of the central jokes of this film is that nobody really wants to be there. Everybody is simply paid to be there. Hence we have the objective violence once again. In fact, there's one scene in particular in which this theme of objective and systemic violence is actually made quite explicit, in which two henchmen appear at the woman's apartment, and essentially they are asked to detain her there. But they don't want to, they're a bit embarrassed by the situation, and yet she begins resisting them, and essentially they fight, and so they have to hold her down and tie her up, and whilst they are holding her, and she is holding them, they are gripping each other in the embrace of this struggle, another worker comes into the room and essentially says, who's holding whom here? In other words, everybody is complicit in some way in this scenario. Now, I'd like to briefly take a step back and talk about another concept, which is Rancière's concept of the part of no part. Or, to be more precise, it is what Rancière calls the part who have no part. Now, the strict definition of the part of no part is that it is those people who are systemically excluded from life, the invisibles, as it were. Once again, I was saying that those people who constantly surround us doing menial labor so as to allow for the seeming frictionless participation in late-stage capitalism. The toilet cleaners, the security guards at the luxury malls, etc. These are the part of no part, or what Rancière calls the part who have no part, who are essentially asked to be outside of life, and yet nevertheless, by means of standing outside of it, being supposedly neutral to it, facilitate it. It simply wouldn't be possible for us to engage in our day-to-day existence without the work provided by these people. In fact, to go back to 2020 and the first months of the pandemic, when there was so much debate about the idea of essential workers, here we can see the ideological tension when it comes to articulating what work we find to be essential. What we discovered is that the work that we find to be essential is often the work that we usually find to be invisible. In other words, the work that we usually would value very little suddenly became the work that we designated as being essential. And of course, the key ideological inversion was that in 2020, these essential workers were thereby those who were the most expendable, those who were essentially considered, expendable by those who were sitting safely in their houses or their mansions, protected from the virus in its initial stages. But Rancière's concept of the part of no part is also a political theory. His basic argument is that the part of no part not only facilitate day-to-day existence, but their very, if you will, identity as a group is co-constitutive of the whole as such, which I'm not being very clear here, but what he means is that politics is the organization of the part of no part. It is the rendering visible of the invisible. This could be both the voice of the voiceless, the articulation of the absence of rights of these figures, but it could also be, by means of cinema and art, the telling of stories through which this very part of no part becomes manifestly visible. In fact, there's a wonderful scene in the film Anora in which she goes to her employer, who essentially owns a strip club, and says to him that she's going to take a week off. And he says, "No, you're not going to take a week off." And then she says, "At the point that you start giving me a healthcare plan, as well as a decent wage, that's the point at which you can tell me whether or not I'm going to take a week off." And so she essentially leaves behind her employer, although the irony of the film is that she only does this to go and work for somebody else. Now, I'd like to take a step back for a moment once again and talk a little bit about what you might call, or attempt what you might call, a Žižekian analysis of the film Anora. So one of the things that Žižek has argued is that one of the central aspects of alienation within capitalism is that it stages a game of false appearances, which is to say we essentially interact with each other in inauthentic ways. Everybody is working for somebody. Everybody has a job to do. In other words, we engage with each other depending on the various hierarchies or class relations that we find. For example, if you encounter a worker who's cleaning your apartment, you're less likely to acknowledge them as a human being. You're simply treating them as a worker. But this isn't Žižek's only point. His point isn't that we should all be equal and that we all should see each other as true human beings, as authentic subjects, etc. His point is that the game of false appearances is precisely to try to render these people somehow invisible. And the way in which we do this is by insisting, paradoxically, on the very fact that we are their friends. This is what Žižek calls one of the paradoxes of what he calls liberal alienation. For example, somebody who says, the cleaner isn't just a cleaner, she's also somebody who I would consider my friend. And Žižek says that this is worse than direct exploitation. In fact, he says, when it comes to your day-to-day job, the contemporary ideological, liberal, politically correct stance is that your boss, who has power over you, who might even exploit you, is the one who says, consider me to be a colleague. Consider me to be just like you. And Žižek says what makes this such an obscene version of exploitation is that, strictly speaking, both of you know that this is not true. That if push were really to come to shove, this would immediately fall apart. And so the objective violence here is that you are essentially being asked to pretend like your boss is just a friend, that the maid is simply part of the family. The more extreme version of this, of course, is the radical revisionist right-wing history by which slavery was supposedly a good thing, as the household slaves were treated so well, or the narrative of the white man's burden by which uncivilized folk were raised up into higher strata of social life, etc. Zizek says that the true violence of ideological exploitation, what he calls objective violence, is therefore never direct subjective exploitation, but always this meta level by which the very exploitation is somehow renaturalized into social life as being a good thing. For example, we might say that someone who owns a factory isn't exploiting their workers, he is creating jobs. Hence, exploiting the labor force becomes a version of creating jobs. Here we have what Zizek would call the game of false appearances, the process by which someone's exploitation becomes recast as a form of emancipation. And for Zizek, this is the central ideological motif of all capitalism, which is to say, the process by which you essentially exploit yourself so as to level up in life. This means that in capitalism, we don't have subjective violence necessarily. We don't have direct authoritarian processes by which you become oppressed by direct means. Instead, within contemporary capitalism, you are expected to exploit yourself. You are expected to hustle and grind and treat the people around you as essentially people to be used so that you can work your way up in the system. Hence, Zizek's argument is that the ultimate form of objective violence isn't simply the systemic violence by which labor is made invisible. It's the truly systemic violence by which we take the systemic structures of violence in capitalism and we naturalize them and apply them to ourselves. And so we start acting as if we were the perfect capitalist subjects who want to exploit others. And here we have, to return to the part of no part theory, the political aspect. The part of no part is therefore rancière, that category of the populace that contains a kind of truth as to the overall ideological functioning of the status quo. Which is to say, it's not simply about the direct emancipation of the part of no part. It's not simply about giving them better wages or better representation or providing them with a political voice. Instead, it's realizing that the analysis of the structural forms of violence and oppression that are manifest in the part of no part is how we can see the truth, how we can see the truth of capitalism as such. The truth of capitalism, to put it very simply, is that capitalism reproduces itself by creating capitalist subjects who see the world in terms of capitalism, who see it through the lens of personal and individual enrichment. In other words, the ideology is the fantasy that supplements this process by which you exploit yourself so as to facilitate and recreate the structural mechanisms of capitalism. And that is the truth of the part of no part. And once again, I think this is where Anora actually succeeds as a form of leftist cinema, as a form of the critique of ideology. And it makes sense that it works as a comedy, that it works as a kind of satire. In fact, we've seen in the past years other Golden Palm winners, such as The Triangle of Sadness, do something very similar, in which it uses social satire as a way to point out some of these dissonances within the ideological fantasies that are sold to us by cinema. And so cinema is a double-edged sword. Cinema, on the one hand, has the immense ideological power of naturalizing and selling us fantasies as if they were our own. And yet cinema also has the power to undermine these very fantasies from within, and therefore to give us a language by which we might articulate some form of resistance, or perhaps think of and conceptualize and imagine the world in a different way. And this perhaps is the central theme of the film Anora. As Zizek once said, the true tragedy of capitalism isn't that we can't resist, it's that we can't no longer articulate a language through which proper resistance might be conceptualized or considered possible in the first place. Which is to say, for Zizek, it's not about directly waging war on capitalism or some kind of nonsensical binary idea like that. Instead, it is about articulating the very process by which we imagine ourselves in an emancipated state. And towards the end of the film, without wanting to spoil it, we see that what's hard is that these characters, who essentially have learned to be the part of no part, who have made peace with the fact that their lives don't matter and that they simply have to do what they don't want to do so as to make their employers happy, that these people realize that they don't have a way of expressing themselves. Even amongst and to each other, they lack a language, as it were, to express their identity, their feelings, where they're at. And so the title is actually quite telling here. Anora, the title, is the name of the character. And in one of the later scenes, Anora is talking with I believe, a Russian character whose name is Igor. And he says Igor means warrior. And she laughs at him, and she says, and this is the beautiful meta comment about the power of cinema, she says, no, don't you know Igor just means ugly hunchback slave assistant. And here we have the meta commentary on the one hand, that this is the cinematic Western image of Igor as the assistant to the master, genius, etc. But also in the film, Igor is in fact simply a kind of slave, a servant to the billionaire class. And then he turns to her and says, well, I'm going to look up what Anora means. And here we have, perhaps, to my mind, the most emancipatory and hopeful moment in the cinema. It's the inquiry into the manner in which their names have meaning and matter, and how the name that they are given is something which can have different meanings depending on how they fill it in. And the final shot of the film, which I won't spoil, is a deeply sad and yet also, I think, profoundly moving moment in which they try to express to each other a kind of solidarity, lacking the very language of solidarity as such. And so the film ends quite abruptly with the possibility of solidarity in a space in which there is as of yet no articulation of such a thing possible. However, before I end, I'd like to say that I really do hope that you watch this film, Anora. The way that I've talked about it might make it seem a bit ponderous and heavy-handed, and nothing could be less true. It's a deeply, deeply funny movie. In fact, I'd like to end on an anecdote that I had from an experience that I had whilst watching this film. A scene, something happened in the cinema that could have been taken directly from the film. So we were watching this movie at the cinema, and all of a sudden, 6 or 7 security guards come into the theater. The lights go on, the movie screen freezes, and the security guards sort of yell up at us, all right, we know who you are, we know you're not supposed to be here, so get out. A classic scene of Althusserian interpolation, if you ever had one, because of course we all felt like we were being addressed personally. And yet all of a sudden, all around us, about 10 or 11 hooded youths who had snuck into this movie suddenly appeared all around us and were escorted outside of the building as they hadn't paid for tickets and as they were underage. Ironically, the frame had actually frozen in the middle of a sex scene as the billionaire son was about to climax. The security guard, realizing this, looked up at us and, laughing, said to us, well, enjoy, I guess. And then he walked away. And here we have a brilliant encapsulation of the central satirical element of this film, which is that constantly the film reminds us that whilst you are immersed in the fantasy, there are people all around you who are simply trying to get through a day's work. And that's exactly what happened in the movie. Whilst we were watching the sex scene between the sex worker and the billionaire son, the security guards were simply doing their work of trying to make sure that nobody had snuck in. And that was the perfect meta encapsulation of this film to me, and certainly one of the strangest things that I've witnessed in a movie theater. By the way, drop a comment letting me know what your strange movie theater experiences have been. So that is Anora and some of the philosophical concepts and subjects that the film brought to mind. The film is called Anora by Sean Baker. I believe it was the recipient of the Golden Palm, and I highly recommend it. Thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to support my work, please do consider becoming a patron. And as a patron, you can now join me for the bonus Discord discussion, which I host together with my wonderful co-host, Jenaline. We're going to go live in about 5 minutes. See you then.